Hi folks, I'm Gary from Organisations That Matter. I work with leaders and help them to lead in a manner that is great for themselves, great for their followers, and most importantly, great for their organisation. All three are possible. If you'd like to learn how to do that, just reach out and connect with me. I'm going to speak with you about how understanding your brain and how it works will help you cope through these challenging times. And I'm going to be referencing some information from Paul D. Maclean, who was a neuroscientist. Fundamentally, if you were to slice my brain in half and lay it down on the table, you'd see that it's got three fundamental concentric circles that make up that brain. You've got the bottom part called the basal ganglia, you've got the middle part called the limbic system, and then you've got the neocortex. And as you can see, we've got three parts of that brain that relate to our evolution, in fact. So our lizard brain, the basal ganglia, is also found in reptiles, and that's known for helping us to be able to focus on the now. It helps us with our fight, flight, or freeze mechanism. It helps us to search for food and shelter, and it's all about reproduction. Now, again, if you think about a reptile or a lizard, it's just focused on right now. What's happening in this moment? How do I survive? Our mammalian brain, well, that's where we get the need for status. You think about it, when you walk into a room, you cannot help but quickly assess where do you fit, and then you'll behave according to either your agreement or disagreement with your assessment of where you fit with your status. It'll impact your behavior directly, and it's a very subconscious, intuitive decision that you're making when you walk into that room. Most of us accept where we fit and behave accordingly. Occasionally you have people that will rebel against that status and fight against it. And if you think about a pride of lions, and if one lion doesn't like their status, then they will take on the Lion King. And by the way, how do all the lions know who the Lion King is? It's an interesting question, but they actually do, don't they? And you might say things like, well, it's the strongest, the toughest lion, the one that defeated the others. And yes, they're all true, but not every lion in the pride of lions actually had a fight with it to work it out. It just observed and said, that one's stronger than me, I'm going to let that one be the Lion King. Now, the one that does take it on, if it loses, it gets expelled. And that expulsion from the tribe, unless it can quickly take over another one, is what fundamentally causes that lion to then die. And they say that it doesn't die because it can't feed itself. It actually dies because it's missing that sense of love and belonging, and of course it's lost its status. So our status, love and belonging, the need for food and shelter, fight, fly and freeze mechanism, reproduction and focusing on now are all part of our emotional brain. Now, emotional and or irrational doesn't mean wrong, okay? That's really important. These two parts of our brain have really served us well in our 300,000 plus years of evolution to become the creatures that we are now. But at the same time, that emotional part of our brain is still ever present, and it causes lots of chemicals to get sent out around our body. Now, the human part of our brain, that's where we get to have the future and the past, so we can do plans, we can reflect on the past, and it's also where in our frontal lobe, our complex developed language sits. So you think about it, language actually sits in the neocortex. While other creatures can communicate, they can't speak and talk like we can, like what I'm doing right now, because that's part of the human element of our brain. Now, if you think about emotional events that happen in your life, really fabulous things, it might be you've won a championship in sport, or you've got a great result for your year 12 studies, or entry into university studies, and people say, how do you feel? And you say, I can't describe it. It's because the words for that emotion don't exist in that part of our brain. We actually have to let them come up, or if someone's experienced a really major trauma, you'll find that often they literally can't speak. There are no words when they've suffered a trauma. And again, it's because language doesn't sit in that part of our brain. It's separate to that. So it's important to understand that these different parts of our brain are actually taking effect on us as we're experiencing the pandemic. And isolation, for example, is why it's so challenging. In fact, humans are being isolation and putting people in solitary confinement in prisons and in war scenarios for centuries and centuries, because it's such a powerful way to get human beings to suffer. We're actually a social creature. We need the connection with our mammalian brain to be connected with other fellow human beings. So our emotional brain right now during the pandemic is releasing chemicals, and we need to use our human neocortex to understand that. Now, you can't stop these chemicals from being released because it's natural for them to be released based on what our brain is observing in the world around it. And that's where we can actually have some impact. You see, our brain actually wants to know why things are happening. From that lizard perspective, it wants to understand how we should behave, which is a shared values, and why shared values are so important for us. So important with our families, with our organizations, and even with our cities and states and countries, if you want to take it to that level. And then the what is the detail of what we need to actually do. So in isolation, there'll be certain rules you've got to follow. If you understand why you've got those rules, if you understand that we are in it together and we're working together, it makes it easier to understand what those rules are, and then through the collection of why, how, and what, be able to actually follow them. Now, again, in terms of the chemicals being released from our brain, you may be aware that our brain is like Velcro to bad news and Teflon to good news. Good news just seems to slip right off. Now, one of the reasons for that is that as we're evolving, good news is good, but bad news could actually kill you. So bad news could kill us. And as a result of that, our brain sort of taught us to be more attentive to it. They even argue that it's a 14-to-1 ratio. Our brain will notice bad news 14 times more than it'll notice good news. So we are consumers of news. We are so lucky that while we are going through this pandemic, unlike our fellow humans 100 years ago with the Spanish flu, we've got the internet. We can actually still do a lot of things and access a lot of information. That said, though, given that the news probably matches that 14-to-1 negative to good ratio, just look at the headlines to see that I'm pretty accurate there. What that does is get that emotional part of our brain really fired up and sending out lots of chemicals that are fundamentally about fight, flight, or freeze, or chemicals that are actually making us even feel more isolated and more out of control. And as a result of that, it might not be healthy for us. So we need to monitor the amount of news we access. So I'm not saying don't watch it. You know, the brain can handle that ratio of negative to good. But we do need to go and find at the moment some extra good just to get some more balance into the system. You know, think about how these ratios are reflected in the social media that you consume. And again, if you're following people and you seem to feel angry every time you see what they post, you know, consider stop looking at it, because literally your brain is hijacking you with the emotions that come with your distress at what you're seeing, because it actually is seeing that it's threatening your existence. And our brain's designed to work like that because it actually has worked for such a long time. But at the moment, when we're actually not being threatened physically by what we see on the news or in social media, we could do ourselves a favor by trying to find more balance from the positive stories out there, or even just letting some of the viewing, etc., go and not actually doing it as much. You know, consciously consider with families watching feel-good movies. You know, true stories that make you feel good and get some of those good chemicals floating around our body and calming that emotional brain. So folks, there's just some quick tips there with some science from neuroscience, in this case, Paul D. Maclean, to back up what we're saying. We wish you all the best during these challenging times. If you want to reach out and connect with me, please feel free to do so, especially through LinkedIn. Once again, I'm Gary Ryan from Organisations That Matter, and I look forward to working with you next time. reach out and connect with me. I'm going to speak with you about how understanding your brain